joy unspeakable and full of colors, found a hope so bright and clear, living in the realm of grace so vivid, a Savior's radiance so very near to me.
Someone once said, "Seek as a plain duty to cultivate a buoyant, joyous sense of the crowded kindnesses of God in your daily life." Today on Connect with Skip Heitzig, Skip explains how to guard your joy when circumstances threaten to deflate it.
I don't know if you have heard the name Billy Sunday, or if you know much about who he was. Billy Sunday was a professional baseball player. He was a center fielder for Chicago who got converted and became an evangelist. And he was a fiery evangelist, so much so that when he would speak, people would remark on the joy and enthusiasm that emanated from Billy Sunday. Well, he spoke a lot on the subject of joy. One of the things he said is, don't look as if your Christianity hurts you. Isn't that good? There's too many people say, I'm a Christian. They wince their way through life. He also said, the trouble with many people is that they have just enough religion to make them miserable. But my favorite quote by Billy Sunday on the subject of joy is this: if you have no joy, there's a leak in your Christianity somewhere. My question to you this morning is, have you sprung a leak? Have you sprung a leak in joy? Has your joy sprung a leak? Now, there are a number of things in life that can challenge anybody's joy. Circumstances can, people can, everyday problems can, overwork, sin, doubt, disease, chronic pain. Those are just a few things that can challenge our joy. However, if those things steal your joy, you got a problem. And the biggest problem is Paul the Apostle. You say, Skip, how do you figure that's our biggest problem? Because if those things can steal your joy, you've got an apostle. You've got someone telling you to be joyful who has every reason not to be joyful. Now, we already know from studying this book that Paul writes this from a jail cell. He does not know if the verdict's going to be live or die. But before we even read this text, let me remind you of something else Paul wrote. This is 2 Corinthians. It's a paragraph that he wrote in 2 Corinthians 11. Listen to Paul describing his Christian background up to this point. He said, I have worked harder. I have been put in jail more often. I have been whipped times without number, faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jews gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I have been beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I have traveled many weary miles. I have faced danger from flooded rivers and from robbers. I have faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on stormy seas. And I have faced danger from men who claim to be Christians, but are not. I have lived with weariness and pain and sleepless nights. Often I have been hungry and thirsty and have gone without food. Often I have shivered with cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. Then besides all of this, I have the daily burden of how the churches are getting along. So how are you doing? I mean, with this guy's background, and yet Paul the Apostle felt he was so anchored to Jesus Christ, so trusting in Jesus for his future, that he felt it was no way he could not have joy. He couldn't help but be joyful. And that has been a key note in this letter up to this point. We've noted that. I want you to note it one more time. Go back to chapter 1, verse 3, and just notice this. This prisoner in jail, facing death possibly, verse 3 says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you all with joy. Verse 18, chapter 1. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Chapter 2, verse 16. Holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Yes? And if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. In other words, if this costs me my very life and I die in the process, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. Now let's skip ahead. Look at chapter 4, verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Okay, so if you were to go back and go through this letter and count how many times Paul uses joy or rejoice or rejoicing, you would count 14 times in all just in this letter. Now, with that as our background, let's look at our verses this morning, Philippians chapter 3, and we're only going to look at 3 verses, 1, 2, and 3. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. For me to write the same things to you is not tedious, but for you it is safe. Beware of dogs. Beware of evil workers. Beware of the mutilation, for we are the circumcision who worship God in the Spirit, rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. Now, immediately you notice that though he's talking about rejoicing, he uses some pretty strong language, very vivid warnings. Why? I think he wants to shock them a bit. I think he wants their attention. Their joy is being threatened, and he wants to keep them safe from the things and the people that are a challenge to their joy, that are possibly robbing them of joy. You know, sometimes when you give instructions to people, they've heard them before, so they're not listening. And so you introduce an element of shock to draw them in so they get the point. So let me give you an example. There was a principal of a school, a junior high school in Oregon. He had a problem. Some of the girls in that junior high school were wearing lipstick. They go in the little girls in the girls' room and put lipstick on, but then they would press their lips up against the mirror, leaving dozens of lip prints in the restroom. So the principal kindly asked them not to do that, instructing them why. We have to clean up every time you do that. Please don't do that. You think it helped? Didn't help at all. They kept doing it. So he thought, well, I got to get a little more creative. So he invited all the girls into the restroom, said, I'm going to give you a demonstration. This is how hard it is to clean the mirror. So he got all the girls in the room and said, now girls, when you put your lip prints up there, we got to clean it every day. And here's a custodian to show you that it's not that easy of a task. Well, they're just sort of licking their little clicks, talking and not really paying attention and giggling. So he says, okay, I'm going to demonstrate. So he tells the custodian to demonstrate cleaning the mirror in the bathroom. So the custodian gets the long-handled squeegee, dips it in the toilet, scrubs the marks off and squeegees it off. Since that day, there have been no more lip prints on the mirrors in the girls' restroom. He's a pretty smart guy, isn't he? That little shock value changed everything. Well, so Paul does the same thing in these 3 verses, especially in verse 2. What I want to show you here are 3 defenses that will stop leaking joy. 3 defenses that will help you against your joy leaking out. First of all, joy must be guarded. Look at verse 1. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. Now, let me just say that Just because Paul says finally here doesn't mean he's done. He's got a whole half a book left. So he's a preacher, so when he says finally, doesn't mean finally. It means I have a whole second half of the book to go. So it doesn't mean he's lying. It just means that the word translated here should probably have been translated more appropriately, furthermore, or also, or on another vein. That's what the word can mean. It's translated here finally. He's going to use this word again in chapter 4, verse 8. When he does it that time, he is closing the letter down. But here finally means furthermore. So furthermore, or also, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. Those words from anybody else would sound very shallow. But when they come from the guy who experienced all that we found out that he experienced, they are very profound words. Rejoice in the Lord. Now, he's given them a command. In fact, it's what's called the present active indicative, which would be translated this way. Go on constantly rejoicing, or be continually rejoicing. Now, when I discovered that that's what that wording means, that tells me something about joy. Number one, it tells me that joy has much less to do with what's going on around you and much more to do with what's going on inside you. That no matter what's going on around you, you can respond to that with joy. Second thing it tells me is that it's not an automatic response. This is something that is a learned response. It's a choice that you make to make joy your outlook. How do I know that? Because by the time we get to chapter 4, verse 11, Paul says this, listen carefully, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. It's not automatic. I had to learn that, and I have learned it. So that is now my response. Some of you will remember when David in the Old Testament, King David was, before he was king, he was being chased by Saul, and he was very discouraged and very distraught, and he thought he was going to lose his life. We come to 1 Samuel chapter 30, and we are told, then David encouraged himself in the Lord. So that's Paul. Paul said, I will rejoice, and he goes, rejoice in the Lord. You see, joy was Paul's outlook because Jesus was Paul's uplook. Speaking of that, look at the phrase. Finally, my brethren, he didn't say rejoice, period. He says rejoice in the Lord. Why is that important? Because he's not saying rejoice in your circumstances or be dependent on people for your joy. When you rejoice in the Lord, your joy is a byproduct of a relationship with God. Perhaps one of the reasons you don't experience joy is because you're looking for joy in all the wrong places. You're looking for something or someone else to produce it for you and in you. The way I see it, joy is a spiritual reality check. Let's see, God is still on the throne, check. I'm a child of God, check. All things work together for those who love God, check. All of that produces my response of, okay then, I'm going to be joyful. So I'm not joyful because my circumstances are favorable. Oftentimes they're not favorable. And I'm not joyful because people are wonderful. Because are they always? No. Have you seen the way they drive around here? That's enough to take your joy away. I'm not joyful because I own things or sad because I don't own things. My joy is a byproduct of my relationship with the living, loving Lord of the universe. Rejoice in the Lord. That qualifies the command. Look at the next sentence of verse 1. Paul says, for me to write the same things to you, it's not tedious or burdensome or irksome or troublesome. It's not tedious, but for you, it is safe. No, Paul knows he's repeating himself. He's saying the same things to them. For me to say the same things to you, it's not tedious. He knows he's repeating himself. Living Bible puts it this way, I never get tired of telling you this, and it's good for you to hear it again and again. What does he mean? Well, he's already talked about joy several times, and he's not done. And he knows that people listening or reading this letter could get a little tedious. Okay, so you're reading Philippians, you're reading along, and he talks about your joy, and then a few verses later talks about joy, and a few verses later, rejoice, and after a while you're going, he keeps saying that. It's getting tedious. Hearing things repeated can get tedious for some people. When I was a kid, when I was in the bratty stage of being a kid, my parents would tell me things. They would repeat themselves, especially my father. And I had that juvenile, dopey response, rolling my eyes, and I wanted to finish. I know, I can actually finish your paragraph. Dad, I know exactly what you're going to say. I knew the spiel. And listening to things over and over again got a bit tedious. Well, I'm a parent now, obviously, and a grandparent, and I see things a little bit differently. I find myself repeating those things, and history goes on. A good instructor repeats himself. Let me say that again. Well, Paul says, I've said this before, I'm saying it again. It's not tedious for me, and it's actually safe for you. Now, Paul isn't the only one to do this. Peter, when he writes his letter, he says this, 2 Peter chapter 1, I will not be negligent to remind you always of these things, though you know and are established in the present truth. Yes, I think it's right, as long as I am in this tent, this body, to stir you up by reminding you. Educators have always known the value of repetition. Ask any fitness coach, any athletic coach. My brother's a golf pro, and he will tell you, you need to make that swing and make those body motions over and over again, and he will have you repeat that and repeat that so that muscle memory gets locked in. You repeat it. Even Aristotle, a couple thousand years ago, said, it's frequent repetition that produces natural tendency. So he goes, I've said it before, I'm saying it again. I don't mind saying it again. And by the way, for you, it's actually safe that I say it again and again. Why is it safe? It's safe because he knows that there are joy stealers out there. There are grace killers. There are legalistic people that attach themselves to every congregation. So joy must be guarded, but number two, legalism must be avoided. And that's his thought. When he gets to verse 2, he says, beware of dogs. Now, he's not speaking to mailmen who are delivering your mail with a little sign, beware of dog. He's speaking about something different. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation. Notice 3 times he uses the word beware. Beware, beware, beware. These are warnings. Who is he warning them against? He's warning them against false teachers called Judaizers. Judaizers. Let me explain who they are. I don't even know if you've ever heard the term Judaizers. I'm not speaking about Jewish people. Judaizers were people who mixed the grace of Jesus Christ with the law of the Old Testament. And they believed you needed both in order to be right with God. So when Peter, in Acts chapter 10, goes into a Gentile's house, Cornelius, and shares with him and eats a meal with him, the folks back in Jerusalem, the Judaizers, they were Jewish people, Messianic Jews, converted to Jesus Christ, trusted in Jesus, but thought, Peter, you can't do that. You can't go into a Gentile's house and have a meal with him. They're like unclean people. They got all upset. Why? Because they said, you have to come through Judaism in order to get to Christ. Paul the Apostle had the same problem. He goes on his first missionary journey. He goes into the synagogues first, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. They kick him out of the synagogues. He preaches to the Greeks in the Areopagus, at the Agora, in every city. Gentiles, non-Jews hear, respond. Well, by the time this filters back to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, they're beside themselves. They throw a fit. Acts chapter 15, this is what they say, verse 1. Unless you are circumcised and keep the laws of Moses, you cannot be saved. Those were Judaizers. They attached themselves to the church. And they said the Gentiles had to submit to Jewish rules, and they opposed Paul wherever he went. So he warns them. By the way, if you're thinking, well, those days are long gone, we don't have people like that around today, do we? Are you nuts? There's always people who have a list of rules to keep, and you have to go through those rules to be right with God. And by the way, not much different than back then. There's been a movement, it's been popular for some time, it's called the Jewish Roots Movement. That's what apologetic teachers will call it. Jewish Roots Movement sounds beautiful. That is, let's get in touch with our Jewish roots and find out about the festivals and the prayer shawls and the Hebrew prayers and light the candles and wear the kippah and blow the shofar. And that's cool, but what they do is a lot of times these are Gentiles, not Jewish people, who are going back to Jewish roots and believe that you have to be under the laws of the Torah in order to be right with God. And so it's dangerous. So Paul says, beware, beware, beware. Why? Because he knows that being joyful means being careful. And we learn a lot about the characteristics of these legalists just from looking at this verse. Notice, first of all, the legalists can be scavengers. That's why Paul says, beware of dogs. That's a term of contempt, by the way. You may want to try that. Go up to somebody and go, you dog. No, don't do that on secondhand. It was like a cuss word. The origin of the term dog in Hebrew parlance goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 23. It referred to a male cult prostitute. In Deuteronomy 23, it says, you shall not bring the wages of a harlot, nor the price of a dog to the house of the Lord. Very stark language to describe a male cult prostitute. Well, as time went on, did you know that Orthodox Jews started using the term dog to refer to non-Jews, Gentiles? So Orthodox Jews would often refer to Gentiles as dogs. Interesting that Paul decides, I'm going to throw that term back at them. These Judaizers who say that we have to keep the laws of Moses to be saved. Beware of dogs. He's saying that's who they are. Now, you probably have figured out that the dogs he is referring to are not your groomed little pets that jump up on your lap, that you put those goofy sweaters on and all that stuff. These were vicious, ferocious scavengers who roamed the streets. They were dangerous. They ate filth. They bred disease. And just as a dog tears and devours, so do legalists tear and devour the grace of God. So Paul says, watch out for them. Legalists can be scavengers. Beware of dogs. Second warning, beware of evil workers. That's part of their characteristic. Legalists can be evil while thinking that they're good. They think they're good, but Paul calls them evil workers. Okay, so what we have here is a play on words, or a play on concept, you might say. Legalists believe that you get right with God by doing good works. I'm going to go through a ceremony and a ritual and do good. I'm going to try hard. I'm going to earn my way. And Paul says, those are evil workers. Why would he dare do that? Because when anyone ever says, I get right with God by doing good works, what they are in effect saying, the work of Jesus Christ on the cross was not good enough. I need to add to that some of my own goodness and righteousness to make that a completed, finished work.
People and circumstances can distort your view of what's true and steal your joy. That's why it's so important to keep your eyes on Christ. Right now, we want to tell you about a resource that will help you experience Jesus' great love for you like never before. More than 26 million people have sampled their own DNA using an at-home testing kit. People's interest in discovering their ancestry and building their family tree has skyrocketed. When we're born again, we get an entirely new and divine DNA. We're adopted by God into His family. Discover how the story of redemption is part of your history and your future in Bloodline. This journey through Scripture traces the DNA of redemption, and it's our thanks to you when you give to this ministry.
I am so excited to let you know that I'm taking another tour group to Israel in 2020. Now, I've been to Israel a number of times over the years, and I can honestly say that visiting the places where the events of the Bible unfolded and where Jesus preached and healed, well, it just doesn't get old. You're in for an incredible time as we travel all over Israel and experience the culture and delicious food that's unique to this country. I'm a big fan of the food. We'll start our tour at Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean Sea and work our way north, visiting locations like Nazareth, the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, and the Dead Sea. We'll spend several days in the city of Jerusalem and see the Upper Room, the Temple Mount, the Garden of Gethsemane, and much more. And we'll wrap it all up with communion at the Garden Tomb, a place that many believe is the place Jesus rose from the dead. And that's just a flyby look at the itinerary. I found that there's always something new to see and experience in Israel, and nothing tops studying the Scriptures in the real-life locations where it all took place. The Bible will come alive to you in a way it never has before, guaranteed. Lenny and I both hope that you decide to join us on what is always an unforgettable trip. We can't wait to see you in Israel.
Connect with Skip Heitzig is a presentation of Connection Communications, connecting you to God's never-changing truth in ever-changing times.